In a bustling clinic, tension simmered as a new chapter began. Dr. Thompson, known for his sharp wit and commanding presence, was about to meet his match. Unbeknownst to him, the seasoned nurse he publicly humiliated was not just any nurse. She was the clinic's newly appointed chief of staff, Dr. Mia Johnson. The morning had started routinely enough, patients filing in, doctors and nurses bustling about. But when Dr. Thompson's impatience collided with Nurse Carter's meticulous care, sparks flew. His condescending remarks echoed through the hallway, drawing curious glances from colleagues and patients alike. Little did he realize his assumptions were about to be shattered. As the tension mounted, the clinic buzzed with whispers of respect and authority. Dr. Johnson's arrival had signaled a new era, one where professionalism and respect were non-negotiable. But how would Dr. Thompson react when he discovered who Nurse Carter truly was? The clinic held its breath, waiting for the clash that would redefine their hierarchy. Dr. Thompson strutted through the clinic, his voice carrying an air of superiority that made some staff avoid his gaze. He had always prided himself on being the most experienced in the room, quick to point out what he saw as flaws in others. But Nurse Carter, as he had called her, didn't flinch under his sharp words. Her calm demeanor only seemed to irritate him further. Behind the scenes, whispers about the new chief of staff circulated. Some nurses who had worked with her before spoke highly of her leadership, describing her as firm but fair and deeply respected in the medical field. Yet no one had officially met her since her transfer, adding an element of intrigue to her identity. As Dr. Thompson dismissed Nurse Carter with a dismissive wave, she straightened her posture and offered a knowing smile. It was clear she wasn't one to be underestimated, but he remained oblivious. For now. As the day wore on, the atmosphere in the clinic grew heavier. Staff members exchanged uneasy glances, silently acknowledging the tension Dr. Thompson had stirred. Patients in the waiting room noticed, too, the hushed murmurs and clipped tones suggesting something was brewing behind the scenes. Dr. Thompson remained unaware of the undercurrent, fully convinced his authority was unchallenged. He was quick to criticize anyone who didn't meet his exacting standards, and today, Nurse Carter had become his target. But what he failed to see were the subtle moments when her calmness turned heads. A junior nurse, struggling with an IV insertion, had quietly asked for her help, and within seconds, she resolved the issue with precision and warmth. Patients spoke to her with familiarity, as if they'd known her for years. Meanwhile, the clinic administrator, who had been briefed on the transition, quietly observed. He seemed torn between intervening and letting events unfold. Dr. Johnson, Nurse Carter, remained poised, every action deliberate, as though she were waiting for the perfect moment to reveal the truth. And when that moment came, everyone in the clinic would have to rethink what they thought they knew about leadership and respect. By late afternoon, the clinic was buzzing with activity, but the tension between Dr. Thompson and Nurse Carter was palpable. Every staff member in the building seemed to be holding their breath, watching the unspoken power struggle unfold. Dr. Thompson continued to bark orders, making a point to critique Nurse Carter at every opportunity, yet her composed demeanor never wavered. The final spark came during a staff meeting. Dr. Thompson, eager to assert his dominance, took the floor and began discussing changes he believed would streamline operations. His tone was dismissive, particularly when referring to nursing staff. He didn't notice the side glances exchanged among the team or the subtle smirk on Nurse Carter's face. When the administrator cleared his throat and announced, "Before we proceed, I think it's time to formally introduce our new chief of staff," the room went silent. All eyes turned toward Nurse Carter as she stood, her calm confidence radiating authority. Dr. Thompson froze, his expression shifting from confusion to disbelief. The air was thick with anticipation as she began to speak, her voice steady yet commanding. Every word seemed to draw the staff closer to a moment they wouldn't forget. The room was still as Dr. Johnson, the so-called Nurse Carter, began to address the staff. Her words were direct yet thoughtful, highlighting her vision for the clinic and the importance of teamwork and mutual respect. The staff listened intently, some nodding in agreement, others glancing nervously at Dr. Thompson, who sat rigid in his chair. His face was a mix of shock and growing irritation, clearly wrestling with the humiliation of his earlier behavior. But just as the room seemed to shift in her favor, the administrator added, "There's one more update Dr. Johnson hasn't shared yet." All eyes snapped back to her. With a calm smile, she revealed that the clinic was under review for a major partnership, one that would expand its reach and resources significantly. However, this partnership would only proceed if the clinic demonstrated strong leadership and a culture of collaboration. The weight of her words settled heavily. It wasn't just a personal matter anymore. It was about the clinic's future. Dr. Thompson's grip tightened on his pen. The realization dawned that his conduct wasn't just an internal issue. It had the potential to jeopardize everything they had worked for. The stakes were higher than ever, and every decision, every action, was now under a microscope. Dr. Johnson's words lingered in the air, her calm authority impossible to ignore. The staff exchanged uneasy glances, fully aware of the gravity of the situation. Dr. Thompson, however, stood abruptly, his voice cutting through the silence. "With all due respect," he began, his tone dripping with indignation. "This clinic has thrived under strong leadership, mine. I'm not sure what changes you plan to bring, but I'd advise caution before dismantling what already works." Dr. Johnson didn't flinch. Instead, she met his gaze with a steady calm that made the room hold its breath. "Thank you for sharing your concerns, Dr. Thompson," she replied. "But leadership isn't about control. It's about respect. Something we'll need to demonstrate if we're to move forward as a team." Her words struck a chord, the subtle challenge hanging in the air. Just as Dr. Thompson opened his mouth to retort, the administrator interjected. "I think it's worth mentioning," he said, glancing at Dr. Johnson, "that the partnership representatives have been observing our operations for the past week, and their feedback so far has been eye-opening." A murmur rippled through the room as two individuals seated quietly at the back stood and introduced themselves as the evaluators. The twist was clear. Dr. Johnson had known all along, her patience and composure part of a larger plan to reveal the clinic